The movie opens in a grand National Opera house filled with thousands of eager audience members. Just as the performance is about to start, a group of terrorists storms the stage, launching an attack on the orchestra and creating chaos. Amid the turmoil, a police force rushes in to protect the people inside. Alongside them, a team of CIA agents, wearing fake military badges, also enters the building. Inside, the police are engaged in a standoff with the terrorists, using gas to incapacitate everyone in the opera house. One of the CIA agents, known as the Protagonist, makes his way to a VIP room above the stage, where a high-ranking CIA informant is being held hostage by a Russian official. After confirming the informant's identity through a psychological prompt, the Protagonist rescues him and prepares to escape. He hands off protection duties to a friend and heads to retrieve a device from the dressing room. After retrieving the device, the team gathers in a secure area where they discuss the explosives planted throughout the opera house. The Protagonist, along with another team member, goes to defuse the bombs while the rest of the team begins to evacuate. While collecting the explosives, the Protagonist is caught by a member of the opposing group and finds himself in trouble. Just then, a stranger with a red trinket on his backpack intervenes to save him. The Protagonist and one of his teammates throw the bombs into the empty upper seats, causing an explosion that effectively neutralizes the danger to the audience. However, as they exit the opera house, they are quickly captured by their enemies. They are tortured for information about the device they secured. To avoid revealing anything, the Protagonist takes a suicide pill. Later, he wakes up on a ship and realizes the pills were fake. Instead of killing him, they just put him in a coma. His supervisor then explains that it was all a test, which he has successfully passed. Now, he is recruited by a different organization, as the one he worked for has declared him dead. Curious about his new team, the Protagonist asks for details. His supervisor tells him that for now, all he has is a gesture combined with the word Tenet. He emphasizes that he must work for everyone's survival in the midst of the tense Cold War. Afterward, the Protagonist meets a scientist, who is there to guide him on the mission. She hands him a gun that has an empty magazine and instructs him to aim it at a rock. To his surprise, when he pulls the trigger, a bullet flies back from the rock and into the gun. She then explains that the bullets have inverted entropy, meaning they move backward through time. As they continue with more tests, the latter realizes he can catch and manipulate the inverted bullets when positioned correctly. She also informs him that the team has gathered various inverted items, and their goal is to track down the source of those inverted bullets. They are concerned that the creators could use this technology to send dangerous items, like nuclear weapons, backward through time. This could threaten not just their future but also their past, leading to devastating consequences for everyone. After some research, the Protagonist traces the inverted bullets to a man named Sanjay Singh in Mumbai. He reaches out to a friend for help in locating Sanjay. To assist him, he meets a man named Neil. When the Protagonist explains that he will not take long to see Sanjay, Neil warns him that the real challenge is not the time but getting out alive after the meeting. Neil then asks about the Protagonist's parachute skills, to which he admits he broke his leg during his first training session. He counters that Sanjay's building is not tall enough for a parachute escape. However, Neil insists that it is their only option to enter or exit the building, given the tight security at the location. Later that night, the two use bungee cords to climb into Sanjay's building, intending to interrogate him as an arms dealer to learn about his supplier. But as they question Sanjay, they discover that the real person to talk to is his wife Priya, who works for Tenet. When she joins the conversation, she quickly cuts to the chase, revealing that the bullets come from a Russian oligarch named Andrei Sator. Curious about why she is selling inverted munitions to Sator, the Protagonist asks Priya for clarification. She explains that when she sold them, they were ordinary bullets and believes Sator acts as a broker, linking their time with the future. Priya urges the Protagonist to get close to Sator to uncover how he manufactures the inverted bullets. Just as their conversation unfolds, the police arrive in the area, forcing Neil and the Protagonist to exit the building quickly. Next, the Protagonist meets Sir Michael Crosby, a British intelligence officer and a contact of Priya, at a restaurant. Crosby shares details about Sator's background, explaining that he grew up in a Soviet secret city that experienced a major disaster which was later used for underground testing. After escaping that life, Sator amassed a fortune, eventually settling in England and marrying a woman named Catherine Barton, with whom he is now estranged. Catherine is an art appraiser who mistakenly authenticated a fake painting, which Sator later purchased for $9 million. Crosby suggests that the Protagonist should get close to Sator through Catherine. The Protagonist mentions he has a strong charm, but Crosby doubts that it would work on her. Instead, he gives the Protagonist a fake Goya painting, one of two, the other having been acquired by Sator. The Protagonist then meets Catherine at another restaurant. There he learns that Sator is blackmailing her by threatening to expose her involvement in the art fraud. She feels trapped in her relationship with him because if she leaves, Sator will report her, potentially sending her to prison and keeping her away from her son Max. She recalls that the last time they were happy was on Sator's yacht in Vietnam, but he had offered her a way out only if she agreed to never see Max again. Angered, she took Max and left, only to witness a woman diving off the yacht just before Sator disappeared. Hearing all this, the protagonist offers to help her break free from the painting and Sator's control in exchange for a meeting with Sator, but she insists she does not need redemption. Suddenly, some of Sator's henchmen arrive to escort her out. The protagonist then tries to follow Catherine but ends up fighting her men off. Catherine witnesses one henchman crash through the door before she is driven away. The next day, Catherine stands outside her child's school, waiting to see Max briefly. Just as Sator's men grab Max and drive away, she calls the protagonist, who appears right behind her. In this tense moment, Catherine reveals that the drawing is located in a Freeport storage facility at Oslo Airport. She shares all the details she knows about the Freeport, and the protagonist relays this information to Neil. Neil disguises himself as a client to check the security and alarm systems at the Freeport. After his assessment, he updates the protagonist about the security measures. To help execute their plan to steal the painting, Neil proposes crashing a plane into the facility for a distraction. During their conversation, they meet Mahir, a fixer who agrees to assist them. Together, they plan to use Mahir to crash a plane into the back wall of the Freeport to facilitate the theft. With their crew ready, the team begins their plan. The protagonist and Neil enter the Freeport as clients, while Mahir and his partner manage a cargo jet loaded with gold bars. They swiftly take down the crew, and Mahir pilots the plane toward the crash site. His partner detonates part of the aircraft to create an opening, allowing them to toss out gold bars before jumping out. The crash causes chaos, distracting the staff and letting Neil and the protagonist escape their room. Holding their breath against the noxious gas released by security, they unlock several gates to move through the facility. They arrive at a room divided by a glass window with machines on either side, noticing bullet holes that the protagonist believes are from an event yet to happen. As they investigate, two masked men appear. One rushes past Neil while the other grapples with the protagonist. This masked man reaches for an inverted gun that captures bullets from the glass holes. Neil returns after unmasking his opponent and stops the protagonist from killing the masked man, just as he seems ready to flee. They quickly position themselves, anticipating the arrival of a recovery team. After the incident, the protagonist goes back to India and meets Priya on a boat. There she explains that the machine is called a turnstile, which inverts time and is created in the future. He learns that the two masked men he encountered were actually one man, one version inverted and the other not. Priya also cautions him not to kill Sator until they understand his connection to the future. After meeting Priya, the protagonist travels to Italy to see Catherine and tells her he has destroyed the painting. He asks her to arrange a meeting with Sator, posing as a former secretary from the American embassy who met Catherine at a party when Sator left early. Catherine agrees and invites him to dinner. At the dinner, the protagonist shows up and Sator tries to intimidate him about his relationship with Catherine, having seen them together. However, he cleverly convinces Sator to arrange a boating trip for the next morning to discuss the opera. The next day, during breakfast, Catherine confronts Sator about taking Max back to England. To her shock, Sator presents her with the drawing, which gives him power over her. Catherine is speechless upon seeing it. Sator explains that he had a feeling to take it out from the vault. After this, they meet the protagonist as planned. During their discussion about the opera, Catherine attempts to drown Sator by loosening his harness, but the protagonist intervenes, turning the boat around to save him. After the boating trip, Catherine scolds the protagonist for saving Sator and for lying to her about the painting. He responds that Sator holds their lives in his hands, including Catherine's. Just then, one of Sator's men arrives to inform the protagonist that Sator wants to see him. Before heading off to meet Sator, he hands Catherine a weapon. In the meeting, Sator called to settle their debt since he saved his life. The protagonist asks Sator not to retaliate against Catherine and also requests help to acquire a case of plutonium. As he explains about the 241 plutonium, Sator recounts his past as a teenager, digging up plutonium in his hometown after an attack. Before leaving the meeting, Sator invites the protagonist to stay the night. Once in his room, he threatens Catherine, explicitly stating that if he cannot have her, no one can. Catherine boldly tells him that if he does anything wrong, she will scream, prompting the protagonist to come to her rescue, effectively ending their deal. Hearing this, Sator leaves the room. Outside, a helicopter loaded with gold approaches the yacht. Curious about what is happening, the protagonist watches from a small window. He sees Sator violently beating a man for stealing a gold bar from the crates. Soon, one of Sator's men catches the protagonist watching. The henchman beats him mercilessly to uncover his identity, but the protagonist remains steadfast and does not reveal anything. Eventually, Sator decides to let the protagonist go, agreeing to help him obtain the plutonium and hands him a gold bar as his payment. He then drops the protagonist off on the shore, allowing him to continue his mission. Later, the protagonist meets Neil and theorizes that Sator communicates with the future by bearing time capsules that will remain hidden for centuries. He believes that the future fills these capsules with inverted materials that then stream backward through time for Sator to collect. Meanwhile, Catherine confronts Sator again, aiming a gun at him in a heated exchange. He retaliates by beating her and takes her hostage. The protagonist and Neil devise their plan and follow a truck, coordinating with their team to surround it with other vehicles. This allows the protagonist to get inside Sator's truck and grab the plutonium case, only to find it is not plutonium. Suddenly, Sator's van drives toward them in reverse, with him wearing a respirator and aiming a gun at Catherine. An inverted car, which had previously appeared to crash, zooms past them. Remembering Neil's advice, the protagonist pretends to throw the empty case to Sator before attempting to rescue Catherine as Sator changes vehicles. Once the vehicles stop, both the protagonist and Catherine are captured and taken to a free port in Tallinn. There, an inverted Sator interrogates them about the artifact's location and shoots Catherine with an inverted bullet. The protagonist claims the plutonium is in the glove box of the inverted BMW. After Sator enters the turnstile, Tenet troops led by Commander Ives and Neil arrive, inverting themselves to save Catherine's life. Now inverted, the protagonist travels back to the ambush site, having been warned by Wheeler, a Tenet team leader, about the risks of interacting with his regular self, as it could lead to annihilation. At the site, he tries to retrieve the artifact but is stopped by Sator, who takes it from the protagonist's car. The protagonist's car, now moving backward, flips over and catches fire. However, in the inverted world, he freezes instead of burning, and Neil arrives just in time to save him. Once he recovers, he hears Sator's recording, instructing his men to find the other part of the algorithm. Confused, he asks Neil for details. Neil explains that the algorithm has 9 parts, with the 241 plutonium being one of them. When fully assembled and activated, this formula could reverse entropy for the entire world, not just for objects or people. As they talk, they are transmitted to the free port at Oslo Airport. At Oslo Airport, the explosion from their plane sends the protagonist into the vault. He quickly realizes he was the masked man that his earlier self nearly killed. As he relives the events he has already experienced, he finds himself knowledgeable about the upcoming moves. After a struggle with his past self, he makes his way through the turnstile to return to forward time, only to bump into past Neil, who unmasks him. When Neil sees him, he simply lets him run away. Outside, the current inverted Neil goes inside, brings Catherine through the turnstile, and joins the protagonist in a stolen van. Now moving forward in time, the protagonist asks why Neil did not mention earlier that he knew it was him under the mask. Neil explains that revealing this could change the protagonist's actions, and their policy is to keep such information secret. While they drive away from the chaos, Neil reassures Catherine that she will be okay. The next day, the protagonist meets Priya, who reveals that a future scientist created the algorithm, broke it into 9 pieces, and hid them before taking his own life. She explains that Sator collected all the parts except for the 241 because he was in the right place at the right time. Priya admits she used the protagonist as an agent. His role was to obtain the package and then let it go, forcing Sator to reveal the other pieces, giving Tenet a chance to recover them. The protagonist reveals that he knows where Sator plans to assemble the algorithm, having overheard the details through the recorder. He agrees to share this information only if Priya promises not to harm Catherine and Max after the mission. Reluctantly, Priya agrees and informs him that Ives has assembled a team to acquire the algorithm, using a turnstile provided by their future allies. She explains that Tenet will be established in the future, not the past. Later, on the ship, Catherine tells the protagonist that Sator is dying from pancreatic cancer. He plans to use the algorithm to end his life at the right moment. Catherine suspects he will execute his plan on the day they were on the yacht in Vietnam, so the protagonist asks her to distract Sator while they search for the algorithm. Afterward, the protagonist informs Ives that Sator intends to bring the algorithm to the hypocenter, the ground zero of a nuclear test. He remembers there will be a detonation at Stock 12 on the 14th, which is likely where the algorithm is hidden. The explosion is meant to bury it for the future. To prepare, Ives, the protagonist, and the team invert themselves to travel backward in time to the 14th. Before they invert, the protagonist gives Catherine a phone, asking her to call and state her location if she ever feels threatened after the mission. Ives then directs his team to carry out a temporary pincer movement. Half, known as Team Red, will move normally, while the other half, Team Blue, will move in reverse. Only the protagonist and Ives know that their true objective is to secure the algorithm, and they keep this a secret, as anyone aware of it must be eliminated after the mission. As Catherine inverts herself to return to the yacht, her task is to keep Sator occupied while he waits to watch the sunset with his son. A chaotic battle breaks out for Team Red, coinciding with the end of the fight for Team Blue. When Ives and the protagonist enter a tunnel, a tripwire goes off, blocking their exit with falling debris. Meanwhile, Neil sees a man setting the tripwire in the past. Knowing the danger it poses to his friends, he sneaks into Sator's turnstile to revert to the present. At the hypocenter, Ives and the protagonist find a locked gate, behind which one of Sator's men is preparing the algorithm next to the body of one of their own. The protagonist notices a familiar coin dangling from the dead man's backpack. Sator's guard shoots Ives, temporarily incapacitating him, and takes the protagonist's gun. Through a speaker, Sator explains that their generation has damaged the environment, forcing the future to reverse time in search of a habitable world. He orders his guard to execute the protagonist, but unexpectedly, the dead body comes back to life, absorbing the gunshot and saving the protagonist. He holds the door open, allowing Ives and the protagonist to enter before he leaves, ultimately sacrificing himself. They defeat Sator's guard and secure the algorithm, but find themselves trapped behind a locked gate in a sealed tunnel. On the other hand, when Catherine sees her son approaching the yacht, she realizes she cannot allow Sator to think he has won. She reveals her bullet wound from him, showing that she is from the future, and then kills him. As the team holds the algorithm but has no way out, a rope suddenly appears in front of them. They grab it and are pulled out by a truck driven by Neil as the place explodes. As Catherine jumps off the boat, her past self arrives, oblivious to the fact that the woman diving will soon be her. Outside, Ives asks the protagonist how he managed to pick the lock. The protagonist explains it was not his doing. They regroup with Neil and decide to split the algorithm into 3 pieces, each hiding their part and planning to end their lives to keep its location secret. Neil is surprised when Ives does not kill them but warns that he will if he ever finds them. Neil gives his piece of the algorithm to the protagonist, saying he is the only one who could have picked the lock in time. To fulfill his role, Neil needs to invert and go back to be the man who saved them. As Neil prepares to leave, the protagonist notices a red trinket that belonged to the dead man who rescued him during the opera attack. The protagonist points out to Neil that he never disclosed who recruited him. Neil reveals that it was actually the protagonist himself from the future. Reflecting on their long relationship, Neil believes this marks the end of a beautiful friendship, while for the protagonist, it is just the beginning. Neil explains that the whole operation is a temporal pincer led by the protagonist, then bids farewell and gets ready to make his sacrifice. Time passes, and Catherine returns to London. She spots a suspicious vehicle, where Priya and her hitman are getting ready to assassinate her. The protagonist steps in just in time. Priya is shocked that he anticipated their presence. He plays a recording of Catherine reporting the suspicious vehicle from the device he handed her earlier. After confronting and killing Priya, he watches as Catherine safely departs with her son.